Hi folks, my name is Andrew Hall and I'm a program manager on the .NET and Web Tools team in Visual Studio. Today I'm going to talk to you about some improvements we've made to the publishing experience in Visual Studio 2017 Update 15.5. We know that publishing from Visual Studio to a remote machine is one of the most popular ways to move applications from your development environment to a test or staging environment to check those applications out. So we've made a couple improvements in 2017 15.5 that I want to talk about today. The first is publishing to container registry. Containers are exciting new development technology. Docker is the most famous example. You may have heard of Docker containers that packages your application up into one unit, and then you're actually executing and testing the same thing in your development environment that's going to execute in the production environment. This really should remove a lot of the pain points of things not working in a production environment that work on your local machine because things are different. They promise that you're running the exact same bits with all the dependencies in both locations. So the thing that's the backbone of the ability to publish to a containerized production environment is something called a container registry. It's where you put all of your container images, and then the hosting environment pulls those images as it needs them, and you can push updates. So for example, when you fix bugs in your application or there's security patches to the underlying runtimes, you build a new version of the container, you push the updated container into your container registry, and then the hosting environment pulls that. So in Visual Studio 2017 15.0 that we shipped back in March, we had this ability coupled with the Azure App Service Linux publish target. So in that one, you could publish to Microsoft Azure App Service Linux. You could take a .NET Core Linux image and you could publish it to Linux and it would create a container registry. You could pick a container registry and it would get up there. But we didn't have the ability to publish to just any container registry. And it turns out there's a lot of locations in Azure and elsewhere where you may want to take an image from your local development machine, put it into a container registry, and then have the hosting environment pull it that we don't offer direct support for in Visual Studio. So in Azure, a couple examples of those are Azure Container Services, the new Managed Kubernetes preview, Azure Container Instances are just three examples of those locations. So with this update, we give you the ability to build your application locally, package that as a container, and then push it into a container registry so you can run it in another environment. Although you'll have to finish the step of setting up that hosting environment through another process such as command line tools, PowerShell scripts, or using a portal-based experience. So we offer three targets from Visual Studio in 15.5. We offer the ability to publish to Azure Container Registry. You can choose an existing one or create a new one if you don't have one. You can publish to an existing Docker Hub registry if you want to work with Docker and use their registry capabilities, or if you've stood up your own custom registry, for example, you have your own on-premise container registry, you can actually do that as well from Visual Studio 2017. So we're not forcing you down one path, we're giving you the flexibility to package those applications and publish them into a registry of your choice so you can use them wherever you need them in whatever hosting environment you're choosing to use. The second update I want to talk about is we've added the ability to edit your app service settings when publishing Azure Functions into Microsoft Azure. So Azure Functions are exciting new serverless technology, and they're very setting and connection string heavy. So most of the functions are going to be bound to various resources in Azure backed by connection strings. And so when you publish that from Visual Studio up into Azure, we heard feedback that the need to go into the Azure portal and then update all of those settings so the application will work correctly was a bit of a pain. So what we've done in 15.5 with the newest update to the Azure Function tools that we've shipped is we've added you the ability to go ahead and edit those settings directly from in Visual Studio. You don't have to leave Visual Studio, you don't have to go log into the Azure portal to take advantage of that. And then the last update that I want to talk about is a small update we've done, but this was based on feedback from you, our customers, and that has been up through Visual Studio 2017 15.4. Whenever you created a new publish profile, we would go ahead and kick off publishing immediately and publish that application with all the default settings, and then you would have to go If you wanted to customize anything, you'd have to go change those after the fact and then do a second publish. So this could cost you time, and also it might not have achieved the behavior that you wanted if you needed to change an important setting prior to the first publish. So we've added the ability to set Visual Studio to defer the publish, so you create your publish profile only, and then you can go in and edit your advanced settings before doing the first publish. A common example of this would be if, for example, you wanted to set Visual Studio to delete all the files on the server if you're publishing into a server that already has an application up and running and you need to clean up old files. For example, you delete a CSS file or delete a JavaScript file, and so you're not updating it, actually you want it to disappear off of the server. With that, let's go ahead and dive into the product and take a look at what these updates look like. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio. I have an ASP.NET Core application that I've added Docker support to. I can tell this because of the Docker Compose project type that's part of the solution, and also the Docker file that's present in the project itself. So I mentioned that this is an ASP.NET Core project. This would work just as well for an ASP.NET .NET Framework project as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by right-clicking on the project and choosing to publish. And when this pops up, you'll notice I have a few options here in this carousel. One thing I'll point out while I'm in the carousel of the various options we have is this right arrow here. There's more options beyond the top 3 that appear. So as I click this, it'll scroll over. I'll see there's an option for IIS, publishing to a folder, importing a profile, and publishing to Azure Virtual Machine. So that's just a quick tip that's not always obvious that there's more options than the top 3 that appear. As I mentioned, the new capability that we've added is the ability to publish to a container registry. So when I choose this, you'll see these radio buttons down here match the options I talked about earlier. We can create a new Azure Container Registry. We can select an existing Azure Container Registry. We can publish to a Docker Hub registry, or we can publish to a custom registry. For the purposes of this, we're going to go ahead and create a new Azure Container Registry. And I want to go ahead and couple this with the new option that I talked about, which is Create Profile. So the default is Publish Immediately in Visual Studio, but we're going to go ahead and set this to Create Profile only, which means that we're going to create the registry, the Azure Container Registry up in Azure, but it's not going to copy our image up, which will just make this process a little bit faster since our image is going to be about 180 megabytes. So we'll save the time as part of this, and then I can choose later to push the Publish button if I so desire. So when I click the Create Profile button, it's going to launch the Create New Azure Container Registry dialog. There's a couple fields that I'm going to have to fill out in here. This DNS prefix field is going to be the endpoint name of the container registry. Now, by default, that is going to be authenticated, but you saw that little tip pop up that said checking name availability, and that's because this name has to actually be unique in the Azure region that we're creating this in, because it's an endpoint that can be pulled to pulled from and published to. We're going to be able to choose our SKU. What SKU of the container registry do we want? Do we want basic, standard, or premium? We'll go with standard since that's the default and seems to make sense for our needs right now. What location do we want this? The West US seems a good place since I'm sitting here in Redmond, Washington. The subscription, Visual Studio Enterprise, that's the subscription I want. And resource group, I had already created a container registry resource group, so I'm going to go ahead and put this into that. If I wanted a brand new resource group, I could click the new button, and then it would go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and close that since we already have an existing resource group. Now when I click Create, it's going to create the container registry, but as I mentioned, all it's doing is creating that registry and creating the profile for us. It's not actually copying the container up because of the choice that we made from the little settings drop down, which was Create Profile as opposed to Publish Immediately. Great, now that that's done, we can see that we have our published profile ready to publish. You can see the registry URL. This is what I mentioned was going to be a publicly visible endpoint. It is authenticated, so it's not like anybody can just push images into my registry or pull them from it. They actually have to have credentials to get into that registry. And I can see that the image name, I don't have an image name yet because we didn't actually publish because that publish has been delayed. If I click the publish button, it would go ahead and kick off. It would build my Docker image. It would publish that up to the container registry, and then I'll have an image name with a Docker tag associated with it. So the image name would be Docker core, and then there'll be a tag associated with that particular build. I'm not going to do that today for the sake of time, but I'd encourage you to go try this out for yourself. It's really easy to get started with and try out for yourself, as hopefully you've seen. The last thing I want to talk about is the Azure Function update, where we have the ability to manage application settings. So as I mentioned, I've installed the most recent update to Azure Function Tools that requires Visual Studio 2017 15.5. And there's a new option on the right side of the published profile, and it says Manage Application Settings. And when I click this, you'll see that it's going to open a list of application settings, which is going to mirror the same grid that I would see if I were to go to the Azure portal. So I can see by default, there's a couple, these are all the default settings that are created in an Azure App Service. And if I flip over to the portal and look at this exact same application, if I click Application Settings over here, you'll notice that these match each other exactly. So what I want to do is I want to go back to Visual Studio and I want to go ahead and add a new setting. And for our key, let's go ahead and say hello. And for the value, let's say connect. We'll click OK. It should go ahead and save that setting. And now when I go back to it in the Azure portal, we'll need to close this tab and reopen it. I expect to see my setting that I just added, which is hello, and then the value of connect. So we can see that in Visual Studio 2017 15.5, the update for Azure Functions brings the ability to manage your application settings in Azure App Service without the need to leave your Visual Studio environment and log directly into the portal. All right, well, hopefully you found that quick demo interesting. We'd love for you to go download Visual Studio 15.5 Preview and try these out and give us feedback on them. As always, you can follow all of our progress. We'll blog about everything I talked about here and future updates as well on our team blog, which you can access via the link aka.ms/webdevblog. Obviously, you can revisit all the great stuff happening here at Connect on Channel 9. Go rewatch the keynotes, go watch other videos, learn about what's new and we're shipping, and then continue your education at Microsoft Virtual Academy. It's a great place to go learn about all of our technologies and updates that we're making and keep your skills up to date. Thanks, folks.